Hello students, today we will discuss about main trends in 20th century poetry. Okay, first modern man's predicament and its effect on poetry. Two world wars and anticipations of a more terrible third one make up the history of the modern age and the experience in some degree of all individuals who have lived through all or part of those years of the many who were killed. But even if there had been no years of the modern poet would have found himself in a situation much more difficult that confronted his procedures. The reason for the change are not far to see. Okay. Many of the spectres that have haunted the generation are directly or indirectly the offspring of science, not merely new weapons of mass destructions, but more insidious, everyday enemies of traditional order and security. Okay. Next is its effect on poetry. Theme of the poetry. In the modern times, poetry has been written on a variety of themes. A poet will probably feel that he was a wide range of awareness and knowledge. The whole universe in the modern poet's experience. The writers on themes of real life and also makes excursion in the world of religion, mysticism and fairyland. He has been much influenced by Freud and Marx and above all the march of science. Next are the symbolist movement. The modern poet of the adopted a number of techniques and devices to communicate to the reader. He has been much indebted to symbolist, imagist and surrealist techniques of poetry, and at the same time he has drawn much of his inspiration from the two world wars and the philosophy of Karl Marx. The French symbolist had a marked influence on modern English poetry after the publication of Arthur Symons' book, The Symbolist Movement in Literature. Next, the Imagist movement. From the symbolist was derived the imagism of Pound. Imagism insisted the definite clear-cut image of sense perceptions, insisted on especially visual perceptions without any romantic vagueness. It also eschewed thought and reflection. The Imagist movement of Pound and Emmy Loyal attracted to a good many of the younger writers, English and American, but Imagist works has not borne very well. Next, the Gorgian or Pietist traditions of poetry. The Imaginists, however, extended the very technique of pictorial effects which the Gorgian poetry aimed at. Their Pietist or Pietist tradition of poetry between 1912 and 1922. Edward Marsh published 4 anthologies called Gorgian Poetry, which included poets such as W. H. Davis, Walter Della Meir, Ralph Hodgson, and Rupert Brooke. The poems Marsh selected tended to be metrically conventional lyrics on rural themes. Next are the soldier poets. Without the poets of the two world wars, modern English poetry would have been poorer in experiments with new poetic idioms and communication of richer sensibility. War poetry communicated the shocking experiences of the two wars in an altogether new way of speaking and explored a new range of human feelings and sensibility, the keynote of which was pity most of the war. Poetry is of title importance and now forgotten, the only exceptions being the poems of Session and Wilfred On. Next है modernist poetry. The war had induced a mood of depression as well as a revolution of feelings against European civilization. In this atmosphere, along with books from Orthodox Georgians, were produced the poems of Eliot. Hopkins and on Eliot's prologue may be said to have inaugurated modern poetry. The poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins were to electricity. Many of the younger writers, the poems of Wilfred On were to have a more prosaic and astringent effect. Next, the metaphysical revival. All these names carry their significance, and some other names and titles will have to define the spirit and directions of these and later years. Herbert Garrison's metaphysical lyrics and poem of the 17th century made Donne and his fellows better known among the literate than they had been. Now the Romantics were roughly dethroned and replaced by Donne and his school. There was a very positive value in the rediscovery of the metaphysical poetry that seemed a unique answer to the poetical needs of our times. Next is the influence of Karl Marx. The influence of Karl Marx did not leave the poets alone. Marxian sees literature as an ideology that reflects that struggle between the classes and the economic condition which is at the basis of man's intellectual and social evolution. Awareness of socio-economic problems haunted the poets of the 30s. Auden, Spender and Cashel Lewis wrote poetry which was largely social criticism. Next, apocalyptic poetry. The apocalyptic poetry of the 1940s began in opposition to the political commitment of the 1930 poet. The term apocalyptic poetry came to be applied not only to the founders of the apocalypse, Henry Rees, J.F. Henry and G.S. Fraser, but to poets such as Dylan Thomas, W.S. Graham, George Barker and others. Next, the movement of the early 1950s. The movements of the poetry early 1950s, including Donald Davy, Tom Gunn and Philip Larkin, consolidated its energies against the apocalyptic axis, countering them with a severe advocacy of religion, irony and traditional forms. The work of the group of poets was collected in the anthology New Lines by Robert Conquest. Prompt reaction discredited the movement, which is evident from Michael Horowitz's anthology The Children of Albion. The outstanding poets of this century have for the most part developed outside movements, regardless of the taste of their immediate audience or the dissenting voices of the critics. They have measured themselves not against their contemporaries but against their masters. Next, main characteristics of modern poetry. Beside the impact of the revival of metaphysical poetry and the French symbolists, some main characteristics of modern poetic technique may be partly attributed To both the scientific findings and the moral confusion of our time, elliptical discontinuity is related to psychology's account of mental process, conscious and unconscious, and also to modern ideas of discontinuity in nature. Poets, whether themselves distrusting traditional values and varieties or aware of general distrust, have been driving back to the irrefragable truth of concrete particulars and the data symbols of private experience over reflections and affirmations in the past, and the products of relative adherence have been either drastically limited in scope or replaced or enveloped by the oblique, and non limited in scope or replaced or enveloped by the oblique, comical and ironical. The modern poems are likely to develop around and through images instead of having a logical structure of ideas. Unlike most earlier poetry, a modern poem may seem to be, in a sense, only half written. Much more is left to be done by the reader, and interpretation may admit a wide solution. Modern poets have often been accused of being excessively and willfully difficult, but the same charge was lodged in earlier period against poets who have long been acquitted.